Okay, welcome to today's discussion of Russia's war in Ukraine. I want to thank our conveners, the Washington Speakers Bureau. It's the world's largest talent agency for speaking events. The WSB roster includes some of the world's leading experts on global affairs and will benefit from that expertise today. We've got a superb panel: the former US Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, former CIA Director John Brennan, and the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. I want to start by talking about President Putin. He's frustrated. The early parts of the war haven't gone as he surely anticipated, and it seems like he's shifting tactics and that we could be heading into a darker phase. Michael McFaul, you've sat across the table from Vladimir Putin. Is this the same man that you were dealing with nearly a decade ago? And how should we expect him to act as his economy goes into free fall and the Ukrainians fight back harder than he perhaps expected?
Well, Jonathan, he's not the same person as I dealt with when I was in the administration. I met with him several times in 5 years, working first at the White House and then in Moscow. I actually met him in 1991, though. I have observed and watched him. I wrote my first article about him in March of 2000. I've known most of the people around him for decades now. And I think it is important to understand that he has changed. You're not going to give me time to go through that 30-year history. I'll bet you're not interested in that. That's maybe for another day, but he has shifted his views in major ways over those 3 decades. And in major ways, I would say just in the last 3 or 4 years. He is obsessed with overthrowing what the Ukrainians call the revolution of dignity. He has been since 2014 when he first intervened. Despite seizing Crimea and supporting the separatists, democracy in Ukraine survived, and they even had a free and fair election with all that drama in 2019, electing President Zelensky. And he has vowed to crush that revolution. And let's be crystal clear. I think sometimes people should just listen to what he says. He is a very blunt speaker. He means what he says. And the night before he launched this invasion, he said, I'm going to crush the Ukrainian military and I'm going to denazify Ukraine. That means regime change. That means either killing or arresting Zelensky and his government and the governors that report to him throughout the country. But it didn't work, just like you said. The shock and awe did not achieve its goals. So it feels like he's moved to a plan B, one that is recognizable to me as the way he fought against the Chechens in 1999, 2000, and in the way he intervened to help support Mr. Assad back in 2015 when he lent his air force to Assad, and especially the incredible devastation that air force did to the city of Aleppo in 2016. And that's what it feels like he's moved to in terms of capacity. His words are becoming increasingly angry. He is also extremely, did not anticipate the reaction from the West. Everybody I know and things that I read, nobody is supporting this war of the elites. And that means he is isolated as he has decided to double down.
John Brennan, what do you see as you observe Putin right now? And what Michael McFaul just described is effectively a campaign of terror. You know, this is terror upon innocent civilians. Putin has an exotic menu of weapons that have been engineered for those purposes. What could a desperate Putin do in the coming days?
Well, I think Putin was surprised that his vaunted military did not just roll over the Ukrainian countryside, but the Russian ground forces really have not been battle tested previously. They basically walked into Crimea to a welcoming, part of the population was welcoming, as well as the parliament. In Syria, they were advising and doing these standoff attacks with airstrikes, as well as missile attacks from the Black Sea, even from Russia proper. So going into a hostile environment was something I think that was new for the Russian military forces. And despite their training, I think they were unprepared, which is why I think we've seen it really bogged down, particularly in the north there. And so therefore, I think what Putin is going to do is to resort to the tried tactics that he has employed in the past, which is the standoff attacks and with weapons, whether it be artillery, airstrikes, missiles. It's to intimidate the population and to crush any resistance that is out there. So unfortunately, I see this going in that direction because I do not believe that Putin has the psychological makeup to be able to either reverse course or admit that he was wrong. He believes, and he has said, this is going according to plan. But that's why I think what we're going to see in the coming days and weeks, unfortunately, is a greater intensity of this barrage that's going to lead to even more and more catastrophic casualties inside of Ukraine.
Just picking up on that, NATO is under enormous pressure now to create a no-fly zone, Richard Haass. Can and should NATO resist that pressure indefinitely?
Well, it can. Whether it should, I would say yes. The problem with establishing a no-fly zone at this point is that would require essentially being willing to risk and most likely go to war with Russia. In order to do a no-fly zone, you don't simply need to shoot planes out of the air. You need to take care of any air defense system that could jeopardize or place in jeopardy your own planes. You're then talking about several hundred miles within Russia. So that's called going to war, and you've got to be willing to risk it. I think it would have been different if we had been here already, and then it would have been the Russians who would have had to make the difficult choice about whether to challenge American air supremacy. But in both Syria and in Ukraine, we allowed Russia, if you will, to get there first. And whenever you're in this type of a contest, it's always best to have the other side have to think about the risk of escalation. In this case, we would have to think about it. So what we've chosen, I think correctly under the circumstances, is what you call an indirect strategy. And the idea is to give Ukraine the means to protect itself as best it can. And part of this would then mean doing qualitative and quantitatively much more than we're doing. So they could challenge the Russians in the air. And obviously it's the rest of the policy designed to, among other things, put economic pressure on the Russians through sanctions, to strengthen NATO, to discourage or deter further aggression, and still to keep open some type of a diplomatic possibility. But at this point, I reluctantly come to the conclusion that I think it's the right choice not to directly intervene. That would raise the stakes immeasurably. Plus, it would give Mr. Putin one advantage, and I'd be curious if Mike agrees with me on this, which is right now he's having a hard time spinning his narrative that Russia's the victim. This was a war that was thrust upon him. Look, this was his war. It's his choice. And as we've all said, as John and Mike have said, he underestimated what it would take to succeed. I'm also a little bit worried that if this becomes a NATO war and a US war, this allows him in some ways to say, see, I told you. Ukraine was simply the first piece of that. And this justifies everything I've done. So I would like us to, if at all possible, to not initiate anything which would justify or strengthen his perverse narrative. If this becomes a NATO war, it should only be because he attacks a NATO country.
Do you agree, Michael, with what Richard just said? Is there in your mind a threshold of action that Putin could take inside Ukraine that would trigger sufficient moral pressure for a NATO military response?
Well, there's a normative question and an analytic question, right? I mean, the normative question is very difficult. I was on TV in Ukraine twice yesterday. The entire conversation was about no-fly zone. It's very difficult to argue rationally and analytically about American national interests with Ukrainians literally broadcasting from a TV station in that tower. You probably all saw it. That was just attacked 48 hours ago or 72, right next to Babi Yar. And that pressure will continue. It is from President Zelensky on down, everybody is making this argument. And as the war moves into the phase that John described, that pressure is going to build. There's just no doubt in my mind. And some people are thinking about creative ways that you de facto do it. You have retired pilots that show up and join the equivalent of the Foreign Legion that for Ukraine. Zelensky's offered that. My personal view is that it is World War III. It is going to war with Russia. I completely agree with Richard. We should have no illusions that that's the way that Vladimir Putin would perceive it if we shot down one of his jets. And we should be careful here. Mr. Erdogan actually shot down one of Putin's jets, and it didn't lead to a giant conflict. That was an incredible move when he did that. So I can't predict with certainty what he would do. But the framing, I don't, with military capacity, I can't predict with certainty what he might do. I mean, given how much trouble they're having not fighting us, I'm not sure they want to get into a fight with us right now as well. I mean, not they're fighting on the ground. They've had so many troubles that John described. Do you really want to be taking on the American Air Force? But I do not advocate that. I want to be clear, because I think the risks are too great for our security interests. Because if it happens that way, then that gives him license to counterattack somewhere else. So we might be able to protect the airspace over Lviv, but what does that mean for other border states of other NATO countries where he has an asymmetric advantage? That's something you have to think about. The other side of the border, the city of Narva in Estonia, it's a mostly Russian-speaking place right across the river. That becomes a much bigger extended war that I don't know where it ends. So I don't think that is a prudent strategy, but I think the public pressure will only continue coming from the Ukrainians first and foremost.
Do you agree with that, John?
Yes, and I think that the Biden administration, along with NATO partners, are trying to push the envelope as far as they can to provide support to Ukraine, material support, political, economic, financial support, without going over that threshold that would then lead to a war with Russia. And that's why I think I totally agree with Richard. There's no way that you could institute some type of air control over Ukraine without having to take out Russian air defenses inside of Russia. So I just there's no way a no-fly zone is going to work. But I think the flow of weaponry, especially some of these sophisticated weapons, javelins, stingers, other things, with the long windup of Russia's preparations in the months before the invasion, I think it allowed the United States intelligence community, military, to provide the type of support that I think is being now seen in the effectiveness of Ukraine's resistance. And so I do think that we're going to see more and more of that as this conflict, if it continues along its current trajectory, is going to evolve into a paramilitary insurgency resistance effort throughout the country. And the Russians are going to suffer, I think, great costs in terms of casualties. The Ukrainian people are not going to just allow themselves to be subjugated. There will always be, I think, an active resistance there. And so I think what we're going to continue to see is a step up in the types of support, short of anything that could trigger, in fact, this broader NATO-Russian confrontation, which I think it only has a real potential to spiral out of control to no one's benefit.
How hard is it going to become for, the Russians are obviously increasing their invasion, increasing their application of force. How hard is it going to become for the West to get weapons into the country? And what are some of the ways that we'll get around those obstacles?
Well, Ukraine borders 4 NATO countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. And so there are a lot of road networks there that can be brought in. And Ukraine is a very large country, I think it's twice the size of Italy. And so there's a lot of rat lines, if you will, that they can move things about. So I think you're going to see not just the weaponry going in there, but also some additional forces, expat Ukrainians that are going to go in, sabotage teams, different types of technical assistance, comms equipment, other things. So there's quite a bit of additional things that can be done to allow a resistance movement to thrive and to really, again, make it painful for the Russians to stay in what is a very large country. Ukrainians have the benefit of knowing their own terrain very well.
Richard, do you see, what are the risks for the future of Ukraine from supplying so many citizens with weapons? Is it likely to make a military difference? And is it worth the enormous risks of civil control and unrest that could come about as a result of it?
Look, we've reached a point in this crisis that there's risk in things you do and in not doing them. I mean, the New York Times had a piece today about the risk of a cornered Putin. Okay, yes. A cornered Putin, a frustrated Putin could lash out using cyber, attacking a NATO country, using chemical weapons, what have you. On the other hand, imagine he had been a wildly successful Putin and rolled through Ukraine. Does anyone seriously think he would have stopped there? The article kind of neglected the alternative scenario. So you've got to choose your poisons at this place. And I think it's important globally and locally that Mr. Putin not be able to do this scot-free. We don't want this. Like, there's an analogy here. There's a real parallel. We were talking about it before, which is Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And when we reacted at the time, and I was in the government then working for President Bush the father, the argument was we didn't want this to go unopposed because we would worry not simply about the local realities. Saddam would control a lot of the world's oil, but we don't want people to basically take note and say, okay, if they could do that, I could do that too. So I don't want an Iran or a North Korea, much less a China, to basically say, okay, it's a free-for-all. So we have got to react here in ways to deal with Ukraine and Russia in a way also that's mindful that there's a lot, as much of that is at stake. We've also got something more at stake, is we don't want to create an anarchic world where suddenly everyone basically decides that he can invade with a degree of impunity. So we are going to raise the stakes. We've already done it through sanctions. We're going to do it by helping Ukraine militarily, helping them on the humanitarian side, the economic side. We're going to have to protect NATO in the process. We're going to have to make sure that Mr. Putin isn't tempted at any point to expand this war that way. We're going to also have to think about what we do in terms of signaling in order to discourage him from expanding it in terms of choice of weaponry. Obviously, weapons of mass destruction, but also cyber. I still believe there's a high chance that he will introduce a significant cyber dimension here, almost in reciprocity for what we're doing to his economy through sanctions. His view will be, this is something I can use to hurt you where it hurts you. So we've got to be prepared.
And you mean cyber? You mean cyber not just inside Ukraine, but potentially a major globally, cyber attack in the US or other
Europe.
Countries,
Absolutely.
Europe. Yeah.
And that's the nature of cyber. And I think what you're hearing from all of us, and it's a real mindset changer. We're talking about potentially a long war. We've all been glued to our TV. There's been decisive developments. We're now in week 2. Think about this less as a classic war. Afghanistan went on 2 decades. The war on terrorism has been going on for 2 or 3 decades as well, or longer, depending on how you start it. There may be no Battleship Missouri ceremony for quite a while here. This could be another frozen struggle, and it could wax and wane. But this may become part of the new normal or new abnormal of what the situation is in Europe.
What should the US and NATO be doing, Michael McFaul, that they're not already doing? I mean, for example, they've so far held off on oil and gas sanctions. Is that a strategic mistake?
Well, the United States should not be importing Russian oil, period. I'm sorry. I mean, I understand inflation. I understand the arguments, but there's no ethical or moral reason that we should be doing that. And I expect that to change soon. The bigger issue, of course, is oil and gas of our partners who are more dependent. I think it would be hard to imagine cutting everything off. That I don't think is viable. But there are more creative spaces in between doing nothing and doing everything. Import taxes. You make it more expensive, and that has a disruptive effect on especially the oil market to make the Russian oil more expensive. We did that. Remember, we did that. We had this debate with the Chinese, and we raised tariffs and under the Trump administration, and we probably violated some WTO rules. I was against those. I want to be clear. But if we were willing to do it in that situation, why is the world not willing to do those kinds of things now? And there are already some movers. Canada sounds like is going to do that. Lifted most favored nations. Since we've been on this call, I'm hearing that the Europeans are now doing that. Well, we should, of course, join that. So I think that would be another move. Another move would be not just freezing assets, but seizing assets. That's a higher bar, and it has implications for the rule of law in our country. We don't want to be, we should have the rule of law for all people that own things, not just those with American passports. But I think the argument can be made in a legal way that would be another step that should be taken. So that's on the sanction side. But I want to be clear. The role of sanctions and the causal impact it has is messy and long. I think there is an obsession right now in America with the oligarchs. And the biggest applause line that the president got in his speech the other night was, "Let's grab their yachts." And everybody said, "Yeah, let's grab their yachts. That's great." And they're grabbing Usmanov's lot. The Germans have frozen it just now. And I want to be clear. I'm 100% for every sanction. Every time one is announced, I say, good, now let's think about what else we can do. I think that this is important for pressure on the economy. But there's a couple of things one has to remember on that. Number one, Mr. Usmanov there's a direct correlation, Jonathan, between those that are most exposed to sanctions because they have money abroad and yachts abroad, and they have the least amount of influence with Vladimir Putin. It's almost a direct correlation. I know all these guys. I used to deal with them. It was part of my job. Some of them I've known for decades. The folks that made their money in the 90s are the ones that are most global, and they're the ones that Putin has the least face time with. And in fact, there's people in Putin's entourage that's cheering that Usmanov's yacht is being taken right now. They are cheering. And when they go after Abramovich's yacht, they're going to be cheering even louder. They are people that are hated within the hardline, hardcore inner KGB circle of Mr. Putin. Whereas the folks that matter the most in terms of that have face time with President Putin, guys like Igor Sechin. Let's just focus. I don't want to get too complicated here, but let's just take him. Head of Rosneft, the largest oil company in Russia, right? He's been with Putin since 1991. That's when I met him, when he was working for Putin. He's been a loyal aide the whole time, an intelligence officer all the way through. He has influence with Putin, but guess what? He was appointed by Putin to run Rosneft. He's rich because of Putin, not the other way around. So yeah, he might be in the inner circle, but he's not going to be going in to say, hey, Volodya, this is really rough on me now. Can you please lift your sanctions? I got to go to St. Bart's. And I'm joking a little bit. By the way, he had his second wife was somebody that liked to vacation in St. Bart's. I met her. I had the chance to chat with her. After the last round of sanctions, she left him. She was a 25-year-old, classic second wife in the Russian sense. So he's not going to St. Bart's anymore. He's in the bunker now with Putin, and sanctions on him. He's like, knock yourself out. And he understands perfectly well that his company that he runs, Rosneft, will be in business forever because it's a global oil market. It's not an American oil market or a German oil market.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about that, especially with the personal relationships that you have. I want to turn the conversation to intelligence because I think this has been one of the most unusual and interesting features of the conflict so far. John Brennan, the quality of US intelligence has clearly been superb so far. Without getting into anything that you're not allowed to talk about, can you give us some insight into what it takes for a nugget of intelligence about a false flag or an invasion plan to make its way to the White House briefing room? What does this tell you about the quality of the intelligence gathering, and what do you make of President Biden's decision to share so much of it?
Well, as a former member of the intelligence community, quite frankly, I couldn't be prouder of my former colleagues in terms of what they have done and accomplished, and also the willingness of the Biden administration to push these things out so that there can be clear transparency about what Russia was planning. Especially over the last 8 years, the relationship between US intelligence and Ukrainian intelligence has strengthened. And so there's been a lot of on-the-ground cooperation inside of Ukraine. But also, I think there was a very long wind-up to this Russian invasion. And so it gave US intelligence an opportunity to see things, to observe things from above, and also to have a good sense of the capabilities, the sheer quantity and quality of those capabilities that Russia was bringing to bear. But the difficult part for intelligence is to understand the intentions. And what became quite clear to me is when President Biden came out publicly and said that he was convinced that Russia had already made the decision to invade, And this was a week or 10 days before the invasion took place. It showed to me that US intelligence had good insight into what Mr. Putin was actually planning to do. And that provided this great opportunity for the US administration to work with its NATO partners and convince them of what they were seeing, so that when the first tanks started to move across the border and it was clear that Russia was going to go into Ukraine as a whole, I think the plans already then were made for NATO and the United States to work very closely together to confront this. So I think, contrary to Russian intelligence, which I think vastly underestimated the capabilities, not just of the Ukrainian resistance forces, military forces, but also the international consensus against Russia. I think in large part that was a result of the ability of US intelligence to gain insight into Russia's capabilities and intentions and then share it both publicly as well as in diplomatic channels. And I think when I saw that Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, went over to Europe and sat down with the European counterparts, I think this is an effort to try to make sure that that consensus to confront Russia was going to be strong and it was going to have an intelligence basis. And so I can just expect that that's going to continue, both in terms of the sharing of intelligence as well as the publicizing of that information as a way to undercut these Russian narratives. And also, I think it's going to be important to be able to try to get at the issue of Russian disinformation, both inside of Russia as well as globally. The more that evidence and intelligence information can be shared openly, I think the better chance there is of just revealing the deceit and Putin's lies. And just one other point, picking up on what Michael said, I don't think there's a single pressure point on Putin. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is the very comprehensive, multidimensional effort to apply pressure against the oligarchs, against the Russian military on the ground, internationally, on the financial front, on the economic front, on the asset front, against the central bank. And I agree, I think what we should do is just cut off all flow of Russian oil into the United States here. And hopefully that cumulative impact is going to lead to increased pressure on Putin that at some point is going to build to some type of crescendo that hopefully will be able to get us off this trajectory, because I don't think that Putin at this point sees an exit ramp for him. He's just going to continue to double down and to continue to prosecute this awful war.
Do you foresee cracks in Putin's support within the intelligence, security, and military services, particularly as Russian casualties mount, more Russians get captured? There's more images of this civilian catastrophe inside Ukraine.
Well, as Michael said, a lot of these guys, were in the KGB with Putin, the Patrushevs, the Bortnikovs, the Shoigus, the Narishkins. This is the inner circle who are in this boat with Putin. And I think they believe that if Putin goes down, they're going to go down too. And they could be, hauled in front of not just international courts, but also Russia's, courts in a post-Putin era. So it's a question of whether or not they want to go down this suicidal route, or whether they believe there is any prospect that they can salvage their fortunes by separating themselves from Putin. And I think the only way that is going to happen, either in that, I don't see that inner circle really cracking, maybe that next circle, they're the ones that are not going to be as tarnished and as tainted with the awful war crimes. They may see some type of prospect that if they can push Putin and his comrades out of the way, that Russia can find an exit ramp, even if Putin and his advisors cannot.
Richard Haass, we're talking about exit ramps, how do you see this war ending? What are the realistic options, if any, exist for giving Putin an off-ramp, something that might save face?
Fortunately, the most likely scenario, Jonathan, is not that the war, quote unquote, ends with a decisive moment, a document, and so forth, but it grinds down. That would be my guess. But it could end in two ways. And John Brennan just alluded to it, essentially from within. That the combination of high costs on the battlefield to Russian soldiers, the economic costs of these really unprecedented sanctions, that you begin to see cracks from within Russian society. Let me give you another historical analogy. This time would be to Iran in 1977. And you had, over the course of 18 months, the gradual buildup of popular demonstration against the Shah, culminating in early 79 of his ouster, the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And what was interesting was growing waves of people in the streets, plus the security forces, a combination of getting overwhelmed and also going over, showing some sympathy. So the question is, can we ever get to that point in Russia? And the answer is conceivably. And I think it's what I said, the cost, the military and economic cost. I think we need to make it clear that our problems are with Putin, not with Russia, much less the Russian people. I think we need to articulate what the peace terms would be, that the purpose of this is not to humiliate Russia, that there are some legitimate Russian concerns, that the goal here is not to threaten Russia, much less humiliate it. I think Ukraine has to ultimately say some things. We should also say under what terms we lift sanctions. That again, that there's nothing permanent. The idea is not to make Russia a pariah. We want Russia to be a responsible member, if you will, of international society. And we should encourage it, and we should say we'd be prepared to facilitate it if Russian policy were to change. There's only two ways I see, though, an end ramp or an off ramp happening. One is that the pressure builds enough that ultimately people get to Putin and they say, we've got to cut a deal, and he agrees to. I think that's a long shot. Let me be generous. The other is the system essentially gets overwhelmed from within. It's another long shot. What I don't think we're going to see is Mr. Putin, wake up one day and say, okay, I'm now willing to cut a deal, and be willing to cut a deal that would be acceptable to any legitimate government of Ukraine. The gap between them right now is so large. When you hear things like denazification, demilitarization, this is essentially turning Ukraine or part of Ukraine into a vassal state. And traditionally, I've written, like all of us, we've written about it. I've failed at any number of negotiations. My career is unblemished with negotiating success in Northern Ireland and Cyprus, the Middle East, and so forth, for the most part. But what it takes is not simply ideas. That's actually the less difficult part. You've got to have leadership that's willing and able to make a deal. So the real question is, what would it take to make Mr. Putin, who's able to make any deal he wants, willing to make a deal? And I think, again, that largely comes from within. And then you've also got a slightly complicated relationship on the Ukrainian side. What would they be willing to do? What would they be willing to compromise in order to stop what's essentially the destruction of their country? Already 1 million have been rendered refugees and so forth. And so I think we've got a lot of dynamics here to come. But what I don't think we're going to get is simply one day we're all going to wake up and people are going to, if you will, opt for peace. Sorry, but I don't see that happening.
Well, if I could pose that question that Richard just posed to you, Michael, can you imagine the contours of a deal that Putin would accept, or do you see things largely the same way that Richard just laid out?
Well, there's, the work of an intelligence officer, which is to give you probabilities, and then the work of a policymaker, which is to take those probabilities and shift them, right? So let me kind of toggle between the two, thinking of my two colleagues that I'm talking here with on this panel.
We're trying to get our money's worth out of you, so that's good. You're doing both.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
So on the probabilities part first, yes, I agree. I think it's highly unlikely that President Putin decides one day, we've done enough damage, I want to sue for peace now. That's not his temperament. That's not the way so far. And I want to be clear, under moments like this, extraordinary moments, people perform in extraordinary ways. So let's be careful about how well we are able to predict these things. But that, so far, there's no evidence that he wants to do that, right? The negotiating team he sent, headed by this guy, Medinsky, somebody I used to deal with, that was not a sign of a credible move to do serious negotiations. So he's not there yet. So I think that's low probability. If he did do it, Richard points out that he would demand a lot for it. demand recognition of Crimea, demand recognition of those two independent states, and neutrality and no troops in Ukraine. That to me will be his minimal list. The one paradox of the moment today, Zelensky could have never agreed to any of that 2 weeks ago because of the politics inside Ukraine. I hosted Zelensky out here at Stanford last summer and spent about 5 hours talking about these various deal scenarios. And he just didn't have the political strength within his own society to do that. Remember, it's a democracy and there's real opposition parties, and he did not have that. Today, he has it. Today, he is a hero in his country. That gives him more maneuverability in a negotiation and to make hard deals. And I wouldn't be surprised if he would, to save lives. I just don't think Putin is there himself. That then gets into this other scenario about inside Russia. And I want to say I'm a political scientist. I taught courses on revolution. I've taught courses on democratization. I'm teaching a course right now, Jonathan, on social mobilization and democratic breakthrough or not. And we look at cases where social mobilization leads to democratic breakthrough and where it doesn't. And it's important. You got to study both, right? Today, right after I get done with this call, we're doing Tiananmen Square. And we're doing Hong Kong 2016 next to some more successful cases. And what I want to say, very honestly, we're not very good at predicting revolutions. John, you tell us, I'm not sure if the CIA is that good at it either. It's hard to know because so many preferences are falsified the day before the revolution, right? You have no interest if you're a billionaire or a grandmother in a village in Russia to tell anybody your true preferences about what you think about Vladimir Putin. But these things happen. Revolutions before they happen seem impossible. Afterwards, they seem inevitable. And what is going on in Russia today? I'm just echoing something that John said about the multiple pressure points that are happening right now. This feels like it's definitely the end of Putinism and the Putin regime. Historians will write about this moment as his Afghanistan, just like Brezhnev stayed in power too long and had a bunch of wins and then overreached. There's no question in my mind that's the way this history will be written.
Wow.
But I don't know how long that history takes, right? It took a long time to go from the invasion of Afghanistan to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it took, a guy named Gorbachev to come along in the wake of that. That's the parts I can't predict. But the pressure inside Russia that will continue. I don't see it ending anytime soon. Where the Patrushevs is a very interesting thing, and I think the Biden folks were really smart about that. The Patrushevs of the world and Bortnikovs of the world, these knuckle, these KGB guys, they're in the boat as John said with Putin, but their kids aren't, and their kids are all. You can look at them, just they're the ones getting sanctioned now, and they're the ones. They're not 70 years old, right? They didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. They weren't members of the KGB like all these guys are that still celebrate together, Checkist Day together. And they're the ones that are defecting. And there's already a few signs. Let's not call these people heroes. Let's call them, rational actors saying, I'm against this war and I'm now in London, and please, don't seize my assets. I'm not going to name the names, but I know some of these people doing that. That's a good sign, and we have to have a policy, a smarter policy, to encourage those kinds of defections. We can't just assume we want them all to go down on the ship. We want to nurture and fuel splits in the ancient regime.
We've only got 5 minutes left. There's two things I want to quickly do. One is just quickly, John Brennan, do you share Michael's optimism that this will be the downfall of Putin, however long that takes? Or do you think he does have capacity, as some are worried about, to go beyond Ukraine and potentially invade and take further territory in some of his neighboring countries?
Times like this, I don't know whether I'm speaking with my heart or my head. I'm very hopeful that, as Michael said, that this is going to lead to the undoing of the Putin regime and the era. And I think it is hastening his departure. The question is how long it's going to take. But I will say that what Russia and Putin are facing right now is unprecedented pressure. Pressure on the military battlefields in Ukraine, international isolation, sanctions, and it's going to be felt throughout the strata of Russian society. And that is going to be hurting people. And so when I think about the weeks and months ahead, I think it's a very, very fraught time because, as I think we all agree, Putin is not just going to change course. He's going to continue to, I think, try to prosecute this effort and to come out of it on top, which means that he may opt for some other reckless steps. Many folks, myself included, didn't think he was going to go through with this full invasion just because of the consequences that we have witnessed just over the last 8 or 9 days. So who knows what he may opt for? And so I guess I am hoping that there are going to be people inside of Russia and in some places of influence that are really going to say enough is enough. This is time to change course, which means, I think, changing course as far as the leadership is concerned. Now, what's going to be the trigger for that? What is going to actually lead folks to maybe take some steps that will lead to a change in leadership? I don't know. But I do think people and historians will be looking back on this as seeing this as Putin's greatest misstep that ultimately led to his departure from the political scene. Again, how long it's going to take, what it's going to look like, I don't know.
Richard Haass, I want to ask you the final question. I remember the early days of the Biden administration when I was talking to senior officials and they were telling me their strategy was to stabilize, regularize the relationship with Russia, bring the temperature down so they could focus on the real threat of China. Obviously, Putin's blown up those plans, but what are the implications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict for China and Taiwan?
Give me 30 seconds and I'll get to it. Just to say two things. Remember, it took over a decade from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to the fall of the Soviet Union. Just that things don't happen necessarily that quickly. Secondly, though, I think there was already a big question over what would follow Putin. Succession is never clear in an illegitimate political system like this one. I think the odds that you will have a negative reaction to Putinism have gone up dramatically. We just have to get there. So whether it happens while he's still alive or after he's alive, I think the idea that Russia will be a very different place as soon as Putin's not on the scene, the odds of that have gone up. In terms of China, I think this is actually good news. And it's a longer conversation than we have, but I think it's potentially a good news for two reasons. One is China's seen these sanctions. And China is much more integrated into the global economy. It's a real economic power, unlike Russia. For China, you've got to be thinking 2 or 3 times before you'd want to bring this on yourself, particularly since the leadership has been, it's got problems right now. It's rocked by lower growth rates. It hasn't figured out how to get out of the lockdowns of COVID. If you're Xi Jinping, your priority this fall is to get a green light on a 3rd term. So I think China has been forced to rethink some of its ambitions, shall we say, or timelines about Taiwan. Plus, we talked about it for 15 minutes here today. We are not going to the direct military defense of Ukraine. I actually believe we would go to the direct military defense of Taiwan. So would Japan. So would Australia. So this is not a cakewalk, shall we say, for China, which, by the way, also has a military that hasn't done anything like this in 4 decades? So I actually think this, by and large, is a bit of a pushback and good news there. It's one of the salutary effects of this. We still have the challenge now of being more involved in Europe. So one question is whether we respond to it with greater levels of defense spending so we can handle challenges in multiple parts of the world. But all things being equal, I actually think it makes a near-term crisis less likely vis-a-vis China and Taiwan.
I want to thank all of you. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for the audience for tuning in. I hope everyone learned a lot during that conversation. We certainly covered a lot of ground. Thank you again to WSB for hosting us, and hopefully we have